Welcome to Arise America. I'm Sheila McVicker. It's a highly charged question, one that could give the Trump administration yet another lever to shift power and resources away from blue states towards red ones. It's a question the White House has demanded be added to the 2020 census, asking respondents for the first time in more than 70 years if they are American citizens. Population counts from the census affect everything from federal funding to how many of the House of Representatives seats are allocated to each state. Critics of the change, and lawsuits have already been launched, say that such a question could prompt those who are in the country illegally to not respond. The cost to California, for example, could be billions of dollars in federal funding and at least one House seat. Joining me now is Ernie Collette, staff attorney for the advocacy and legal aid group Mobilization for Justice. Ernie, thanks so much for doing this. What are the ramifications of putting a question about citizenship on the census?
Well, I think you have to look at two primary ramifications. The first one would be political representation. As you mentioned, the House of Representatives is decided by the decennial census. If you were to
That's the every 10-year census.
Every 10-year census, yes. And also federal funding. And federal funding includes everything from funding school programs like school lunches, federal assistance programs like public assistance, Medicaid, but also infrastructure projects. So as a result, if you have a question of like citizenship and undocumented immigrants who are already fearful of what's going on in the last year and a half with the Trump administration, fails to respond to those questions by ignoring the census, you're going to have an underrepresentation of individuals.
So in a sense, this is an attempt to shift federal funding spending away from population, who lives there, to population identity.
It may appear like that, and as a result, if you have an underrepresentation, that federal funding will then shift to more rural, possibly not immigrant populated areas with large immigrant populations. And primarily you're looking at states like New York, California, Oregon, Washington State, even Florida and Texas. So that's the reason why 37 states have actually recently filed suit to prevent this from happening.
And so if you have a movement of federal funding away from populous, mainly blue states, what you have is more money going into more conservative, more rural, and more likely to vote Republican red states.
Exactly, and you may have a shift in the representative seats in a particular district or in a community that's more rural or more likely to vote Republican. So it will have a political ramification. At the same time, looking at federal funding as well, you will have certain immigrant populations that will not have access to certain resources, but the resources don't necessarily apply just to immigrants. It applies to U.S. citizens and lawful permanent residents as well. So there'll be a disproportion of resources to those more liberal-leaning, more blue state areas.
So the Commerce Department, which is responsible for the Census Bureau, comes from Wilbur Ross, who's the Commerce Secretary. He says this question is necessary because they require specific data to identify violations of the Voter Rights Act.
I think that's a very broad way of justifying this sort of issue. The decennial census, or the census that happens every single 10 years, it's mandated in the Constitution that all individuals are required to be counted in order to determine representation and later federal funding. I think the Constitution should take precedence in this particular situation, and I think simply looking at the Voting Rights Act, particularly from an administration and a party in the past that has attempted to create voter suppression and eliminate key components of the Civil Rights Act, of the Voting Rights Act, is sort of more what you should be looking at.
You work often with people who might be in a position where they're in the country undocumented.
That's correct.
How do you think your clients are going to respond to something like this? Well,
I think in terms of if this question were to be added onto the census, and again, this is an act that Congress could essentially change from the Commerce Department decision. So it actually adds ramifications to the 2018 midterm elections. If the House and the Senate were to switch, this could be struck down. But to answer your question, in terms of immigrant populations, I think it's exactly what's going to continue to happen. They're not going to react to the census. They're not going to actually turn it in. They're not going to be counted. They're going to be disenfranchised. And we've seen this administration in the past attack immigrant families, separate families, prevent immigrant families from opportunity. So I think it's just a little bit of more of the same.
We know that so far 37 states have joined the lawsuit that was launched by the state of California. California was very quick off the mark to announce that they were going to sue to suppress this measure. Is this a case that will end up in the Supreme Court? And it's very hard to predict the progress of a case like this, but how would they argue their case against this?
I think it's very, I think it's very difficult to say whether this case will end up in the Supreme Court. My guess it would be likely that it probably would end up at least in some sort of appeal measure. New York is claiming that they're actually going to be taking the lead on the case, so it could actually happen in my backyard in terms of the taking it through federal court, potentially after the Second Circuit. I think that there's a strong constitutional claim to be made that using immigration status as a measure of restricting funding and creating voter misrepresentation by having an allocation of seats based more in rural areas that have non-immigrant populations is going to be contentious to the Constitution. Really, the founders actually didn't have an immigration issue because immigration law in and of itself didn't actually come into effect until the Chinese exclusion cases and more of the immigration acts that were passed in the 1920s that based immigration on racial quotas. So I think if you're looking at this from a purely founders perspective, which is usually from a legal perspective more of a conservative position, looking at the framing, the context of the argument, I think you have a strong case there.
So turning to the larger question of the way in which this administration legislates or governs, we know that this administration has a difficult time getting legislation through both houses up on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue. And we know that both chambers have struggled to come together to pass legislation. But we have seen the administration take these kinds of administrative efforts over and over again, whether you're talking about something like the Environmental Protection Agency or you're talking about something like this. Is this another way of basically trying to shift the country and alter the landscape?
I think that at the very least, giving the benefit of the doubt to the current administration, it would be maybe a foolhardy mistake. But I think that with the patterns and practices that we've seen throughout this administration, I think it's another attempt by the administration and by the party in charge, the Republican Party, to continue to follow the matters of what we've seen, which is voter suppression, and also looking at potential gerrymandering, an idea that would allow more conservative districts, which means more conservative seats, which means more conservative representation. And I think that if you want to play by the rules of which the founders created, which is to allow all parties to be represented, you need to be able to stop these practices from happening.
I want to ask you about something that Sarah Huckabee Sanders, the president's press secretary, said today at the briefing. She said, she was asked about this, obviously. She said, well, you know, this has been in every census since 1965, except for the one in 2010. And then this question was not asked in 2010. Is that true?
So the Census Department actually comes out with annual surveys that detail a citizenship status. They haven't had the question of citizenship in a decennial census since the 1950s. I think that was sort of a bit of a misstatement. The reality is that this question was sort of eliminated to prevent this sort of possible action from happening.
She was asked specifically about the census. So I can't speak to whether she was mixing up two different things, but she was asked specifically about the census.
Yes, I mean, it could be a misquote, but from what I said is that the Census Department and the Census Bureau has a lot of different surveys, not necessarily just the decennial census. They have definitely many different ways of calculating the population and allocating resources based off of that. It's not just a decennial census. But I will say this, that the most important aspect of what the Census Bureau does is the decennial census, and that actually does affect long-term ramifications as well if you have political funding that could be skewed based off of a once-in-a-decade count of our population.
Ernie Collette, staff attorney for the Mobilization for Justice, thanks so much.
Thank you.